Welcome to week 4 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. Just start off with a look at paper 1. I've finished 95% of paper 1. There might be a few of you onesies and twosies out there. I'll have those wrapped up earlier this week. But I just want to kind of give some observations for those of you who I've marked. And let me just say, the vast majority of you did fine. The grades definitely reflect that. And some of you did really well, definitely hit it out of the park with a very succinct, clear writing style and tight requirements. But some issues, again, and I mentioned this on the papers, the requirements were way too broad. Narrow them down. We had a lot on North Korea. North Korean nuclear program seems to be a pervasive issue out there. And too many times I got, what is the extent of the North Korean nuclear program? What is North Korea developing missiles? Those are far too broad. You want to narrow it down to something like this. Instead of saying, is North Korea developing missiles or intercontinental missiles? Say, are North Korean intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of defeating multiple missile defense systems? Do they have the countermeasures and everything? That is a nice tight requirement as opposed to what type of North Korean missiles are out there. And I just give you that as an example just because North Korea was a prevalent issue. A lot of people did the border. And this is actually, maybe it's just because of the what's going on in the news of late. But a lot of people talked about the border and ISR and what types of systems might be appropriate for the border. Tight requirements are part of the border, of trying to establish where the border is. You don't write a requirement that says, throw out some ISR out there and hope you catch some people. It's not how it works. You have to identify your very focused spots and then ask very specific questions about how they're crossing the border. Are they coming at night? Or are they using coyotes? Not coyotes the animals, but the border smugglers. Are they coming underground? Those are types of the issues that need to be addressed. Not, will our ISR systems stop border crossings? And then a lot of people did this. And these are kind of related. You evaluated the policies first, and that's kind of odd. This group, there was an issue of that. If you're setting up a cybersecurity program for your business unit, you don't ask, is my cybersecurity program effective? Because you're putting the cart before the horse in that, and that leads to unintentional biases where you're forming your requirements around your proposed program to stop cybersecurity. You want your requirement to be adversarially focused. So instead of saying, will my software or whatever, my program stop cybersecurity, say, is the adversary using spear phishing to gain sensitive access to our networks? That's an Intel-based requirement. You want to say that, not is my policy stopping cyber intrusions. A lot of you put the policy before the horse. A lot of you put the Intel asset before the horse. You ask the question, just like the border ISR, will we stop people coming across the border using predator drones? No, that's not a requirement. You're putting the collection requirement first. You want to ask, again, what type of infiltration people are coming across the border before you start talking about, okay, these are the best assets to attach to that requirement. So I want to make sure that's kind of clear for folks. Don't, make sure your requirements are adversarial focused, not, are my policies being good? Are my policies effective? So those are kind of some of the issues that I saw. OSINT, social media exploitation. A lot of you talked about that. We didn't talk about it in class. In fact, you'll have a future class on incorporating OSINT into a collection analysis. But social media exploitation, that's good for a lot of the issues you talked about. It's good if you want to evaluate ISIS recruiting methods in the United States. It's good if you want to analyze Russian influence operations in Eastern Europe. Those are great. There's just some other issues that social media doesn't work. MS-13 is one example. Again, MS-13 relies on not necessarily virtual radicalization, but real person-to-person contact. They tend to stay off of social media. Obviously, North Korea stays off of social media. So social media exploitation is good. Open source is good. Just keep in mind it's not a panacea, or it's not appropriate for every situation. So week 3 review. We had 2 case studies, Pearl Harbor and Yom Kippur War, and I can't just emphasize this enough. I'm not trying to give you history lessons here. I'm trying to ask the question, or have you think about the question, where did these intelligence failures occur? Where along the line did they occur? And I just want to kind of look at the Pearl Harbor case study and backdrop these schools of thought on what caused Pearl Harbor, and you gotta apply them to other case studies as well as we move forward. There's the traditional school. This is brought up that there's just too much information. Analysts are overwhelmed. They don't know how to connect the proverbial dots, even though that's such a cliche term now, because there is too much information out and they can't separate the wheat from the chaff. That is the traditional school of intel failure. A lot of people say 9/11 was an issue. Yom Kippur War fell under that. Then there's the other thought, the reformist school. And this asks the question, it's not necessarily the information or too much information, but the information is not getting to the right people. That the way we structure our intelligence community and our collections ability, that information's collected, but it's not disseminated or shared with the right people. And you'll hear the term, move the boxes around, which means these are the arrangements within the intelligence community, who reports to who gets budget authority. The development of the Director of National Intelligence is an example where, again, you're trying to alter the structure of the intel community to be more successful. In the Pearl Harbor case study, information was collected at the federal level, but it was not disseminated down to the commanders on the ground, and that's brought up in the DAL because of, again, classification issues or other organizational reasoning. In fact, the family members of Admiral Kimmel and General Short have gone to great lengths to try and absolve their names, saying that if they had the information that Washington had, then there would have been no Pearl Harbor intel failure. You're going to see this in the 9/11 case study, where information was collected at the National Security Agency. However, again, because of the structure of our intel and our federal government, that wasn't shared with the FBI or local law enforcement that could have stopped the 9/11 plot. So people argue, again, that's the reformist school, that the intel community isn't structured well. And then there's the contrarian school, where the issue lies in not in too much information, but the collection of not the right information, and that's the collector's fault. The SIGINT, HUMINT, what have you, is not collected correctly. And that's the contrarian school of intel failure. And you could argue, again, in the Pearl Harbor case study, we didn't collect on the Japanese carriers. We didn't collect on other information that would have been relevant to this intel failure. Dahl has a little bit of a spin on it. He argues that the problem is not necessarily with collection and analysis. He argues that it's with the interface with policymakers and military leaders. And he argues that the information has to be tactical in nature, provide specificity in nature, in order for policymakers to react to it. And he contrasts the Pearl Harbor incident, where you had a little bit more nebulous information out there, than with Midway, where Commander Rochefort gave times, distances, locations that allowed the Admiral Nimitz to make decisions to try and intercept the Japanese fleet. He argues, again, in order for intelligence to be relevant, it has to be specific enough so policymakers will listen to it. You can't just give these nebulous intel failures. I think Dahl partially is correct. In fact, I think his reading and his writings are excellent, which is why I assign them, and you'll be reading more of it in the next week. But the one thing I caution is that very rarely will you get specific information about, it says time and location. You're not going to have the Midway example replicate itself too many times. No one's going to point to the 9/11 hijackers and say the 9/11 hijackers are going to attack on 9/11 and they're going to use these planes and it's going to be these people. Very rarely is intelligence that specific. For those of you who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, there's very few intelligence points that will say an IED is going to be at this point in this location at this time. That almost never happens where you get that type of detailed analysis. So we come to the last school, the Sharma School. It's really not the Sharma School. I just label it just for you understanding. But it's Intel drives risk reduction measures. You'd never get that specificity of intelligence, but I argue in the Pearl Harbor case that there was enough information out there to the commanders that certain reasonable risk mitigation scenarios could have taken place. What I mean by that is we had enough information that Japan was going to attack somewhere, and to solve that, you could have done relatively simple things. You could have put the fleet on alert on Sunday. You could have extended air patrols. You could have listened to your radar guidance. You could have done certain things that would have mitigated the catastrophic risk at Pearl Harbor. If you're talking about the IED in Iraq scenario, again, I was in Iraq. There's a huge road called Route Irish, which is a major road that runs through Baghdad that had a lot of IEDs back in 2005. If you had said, again, you can't say we got to close Route Irish, because that's not a reasonable request to make given the threat. But what you can say is, sir, ma'am, this is a high-risk scenario from these times. In order to mitigate risk, I recommend you drive slowly, you use your jammers, you may put out a couple of foot patrols at these times. Those are reasonable risk reduction measures that can prevent IEDs from blowing up your major convoys on Route Irish. When we're talking about the 9/11 scenario, again, we didn't have the information out there that we're going to have 19 hijackers on this day and this time. But we did, arguably, have enough information to say there is a threat to civil aviation, that they're going to use airplanes like a Tomahawk missile, like a guided missile like they did in 9/11. In order to reduce that catastrophic risk, you could do something as simple as putting a drink cart in front of your cockpit, which prevents a 9/11 like scenario. Or you can have 50% reinforced doors, or could put 30% federal air marshals on planes. Those are very relatively, in hindsight, cheap measures to prevent a catastrophic risk or catastrophic incident like 9/11. So one thing I ask, and this is going to be part of your paper, is going to be part of your final, ask the question, could reasonable risk reduction measures have been used to prevent catastrophic failure, whether it's the Yom Kippur War, whether it's Pearl Harbor, 9/11, Russian interference in our election? Ask those questions going forward. And that kind of, I don't want you to Monday morning quarterback, but I want you to ask, are there certain risk reduction measures that are reasonable? And again, I just want to leave you with this. If there was a nebulous threat against Washington, D.C., let's say a WMD threat, closing the expressways coming into Washington, D.C. is not a reasonable risk reduction measure. However, there are certain risk reduction measures, random checks, things that might prevent a catastrophic incident from occurring. So think about that as you're going forward in these intel failures. And then the Yom Kippur War, again, some of the issues that you brought up in your discussion, over-reliance on human, that falls under the contrarian school, that there was just one guy and he didn't report on time, and if you rely on him, that's a failure in collection. You had the concept, the addiction to preconceived notion. A lot of you brought that up, that Egypt would not attack Israel unless they had an ability to counter the Israeli Air Force with surface-to-surface missiles. So they had that in the back of their head. What they weren't looking for was an intelligence assessment. They weren't looking, they were thinking aircraft to aircraft, aircraft to surface missile. What they were not thinking of was aircraft to surface to air missile. What they were not thinking of was tank to anti-tank missile. Those types of asymmetric threats were not part of their calculus, nor was their calculus that Egypt would conduct a limited attack. They believed that Egypt would conduct a full-on attack to retake the Sinai. They were not thinking that Egypt would just come in, cross the Sinai, and then essentially declare success, at least for the first couple of weeks of the Yom Kippur War. So again, that's probably a sense of mirror imaging in that case, where they imposed their own values on what Egypt said was correct. So week 4, I am going to just say there's a lot of work in week 4. 2 case studies, 9/11 Iraq WMD. Those are case studies that might be history for a lot of you, but are certainly, I lived with those case studies in my life and had impacts on my life very specifically. And we're going to go through them. There's a lot of documentaries, a lot of history. What I recommend in Canvas, they're kind of glumped together. I would just recommend doing the Iraq WMD readings and documentary and lectures, and then going back and then doing the 9/11 documentary readings and lecture. So a lot out there. Iraq WMD, you have the documentary, the Rachel Maddow documentary, which, again, she's a partisan source, but she also, there's nothing in that documentary that's incorrect. All the case studies that she brings up are accurate. You have the 60 Minutes Curveball documentary, or 60 Minutes segment on Curveball. If you don't know who Curveball is, you will know about him at the end of that point. You'll have the committee report, the Senate Select Committee report on Iraq WMD. It's 200 pages. Don't read the whole thing. You'll see blue boxes in the committee reports. Kind of focus on those. If you want to delve deeper into some of the cases that the committee reports, please do, because a lot of them are interesting, so go and read detail. But I just want you to focus on the blue boxes for that report. And then you obviously have the Sharma lectures for week 4. And then 9/11, you have some great documentaries, the National Geographic and the Nova on the documentary on the National Security Agency. You have the Dahl readings and the 9/11 Commission readings, and then the Sharma lectures that talk about, could 9/11 be prevented? A lot of work this week. I'm not going to skip around it, but I'd also add that the more work you put in, the easier your next paper is going to be, and the easier the final is going to be. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Look forward to your discussion points, and if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.